Hello everyone, my name is Justin Morris, and I'm a regenerative grazing specialist with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. Today, we're going to be addressing the question, what is regenerative grazing? What are we covering today? First off, we're going to address the question, what does the term regenerative mean? Followed by, how is regenerative different from sustainable and organic? How could regenerative grazing be defined? What are some key attributes of regenerative grazing? Where does regenerative grazing fit among other grazing strategies? How can regenerative grazing improve the ecosystem and profitability? And finally, we'll wrap up with talking about the principles of regenerative grazing. So what does regenerative mean? The root word of regenerative is regenerate. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, regenerate means formed or created again, which is the original definition, restored to a better, higher, or more worthy state, to bring back to a former condition or vigor, to bring back to life, practice, or activity. And some synonyms or words that are very similar in meaning to the word regenerative would include words like improve, recreate, rejuvenate, restore, renew, revitalize, refresh, and revive. What is regenerative agriculture? There is no universally accepted definition, but it generally refers to a practice of farming and land use that aims to improve or restore the overall health of the soil. Managing a farm or a ranch by considering the interactions among the soil, water, plants, animals, and humans, interconnected pieces of one whole system. What is sustainable agriculture? Sustainable agriculture is an integrated system of plant and animal production practices having a site-specific application that will, over the long term, satisfy human food and fiber needs, enhance environmental quality and the natural resource base, make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources, sustain the economic viability of farm operations, and enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. What is organic agriculture? Organic agriculture is a production system that responds to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, and mechanical processes that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biological diversity. What is regenerative organic agriculture? This is a very recent term, but essentially it has come to be defined as a system that prioritizes soil health and no synthetic inputs while simultaneously encompassing high standards for animal welfare and worker fairness. So how does regenerative agriculture differ from all these other terms? Well, when we look at regenerative, and we're just kind of trying to highlight the main parts of each of these different terms, regenerative focuses on management principles that improve soil health and the overall health of the land. So the priority there is soil health. Sustainable is really looking at maintaining and ceasing land degradation. It does not focus on improving soil health. Organic focuses on practices, what can and can't be used, but does not endeavor to rebuild or regenerate soil necessarily. And finally, the term regenerative organic is really the same as regenerative, but it excludes synthetic inputs and focuses also on animal welfare and social fairness. What should grazing be regenerating? Creating again, improving, or bringing back to life? First and foremost, that would be soil health. And included within the realm of soil health, there are several indicators that we can look at in determining soil health. I have listed here several, which would include aggregate stability, water infiltration, plant and microbial available water, diversity of soil organisms, and organic carbon. Grazing should also be regenerating plant health. This would include things like plant productivity or yield, plant immunity against pests and disease, plant diversity, and nutrient content. Additionally, grazing should be regenerating animal health, and included with that would be things like the livestock health, the livestock productivity and performance, as well as wildlife diversity and abundance. A fourth item that grazing should be regenerating would be our quality of life, which can include our physical health, our mental well-being, and our relationships with people and livestock. The fifth thing that grazing should be regenerating is profitability. But not all profit is the same. When we say increased profitability versus improved profitability, the terms increase and improve mean two different things. Improve implies a sense of quality coming through nurturing a living system. Increase really has no sense of quality and could come through extractive or non-regenerative methods. So in the end, what we want to do is we want to improve profits while eliminating extractive profits. So how would we define regenerative grazing? Well, it begins by focusing on improving soil health, followed by improving plant health, improving animal health, improving profitability, and improving quality of life. These first three elements that I mentioned of soils, plants, and animals are really what comprise the ecosystem elements of regenerative grazing. The profitability and quality of life elements are what comprise what we call the people or human element side of regenerative grazing. So if we were to define what regenerative grazing is, the definition that I came up with after going through this process of how regenerative grazing is supposed to improve these 5 different elements would be summarized like this. Essentially, proactively managed grazing that improves the health, diversity, and long-term resilience of soils, plants, and animals while improving quality of life and profitability. It's a holistic approach to grazing management that recognizes and nurtures the intricate and complex relationships between all life on the landscape, including ourselves. Some attributes of regenerative grazing include: it begins with a mindset of working with nature, not against. It looks at nature as a partner. It focuses on outcomes, not practices. And it also focuses on stewardship versus ownership. It's ecosystem-centric rather than grazier-centric. It's a process, not an event. And grazing is not regenerative if one or more of the 5 elements is deteriorating. Regenerative grazing must also be adaptive. This requires continuous monitoring of feedback from the soils, plants, and animals to quickly modify grazing management. In the feedback loop diagram on the right, regenerative grazing begins with grazing planning. As the plan is put into action, the animals, plants, and soils are monitored closely for feedback. If adjustments are needed, then the grazing management is controlled to get things back on track and monitoring is resumed. This is why the arrows between the monitoring and control go both directions. The areas of monitoring and control are where you'll be spending most of your time, as indicated by the oval around those 2 parts of the feedback loop. The attribute of adaptiveness is analogous to driving a car. You begin with a plan to drive somewhere. As you're driving, you are constantly monitoring the road ahead of you, as well as vehicles around you. As the road turns, you control the steering wheel to stay in the center of the road, and you continue monitoring to make sure that you stay in the center. So, while you're driving, you are constantly going back and forth between monitoring and controlling to ensure you reach your destination safely. Some other attributes of regenerative grazing include things like the use of different strategies, depending on the goals of the grazier, condition and needs of soils, plants, and animals, the time of the year, weather conditions, and also social constraints. When planning, implementing the plan, and modifying our grazing management as we progress through the season, two good questions to ask ourselves before we proceed would include: is this plan or action going to bring redemptive capacity back to the land and foster greater long-term resilience? And will this plan or action enhance all 5 regenerative grazing elements, or could this lead to a degradation of the resource despite increasing profitability? As we're talking about regenerative grazing, we need to talk about what regenerative grazing is not. It is not a specific grazing system. It's not a boilerplate or cookie cutter system. It's not rigid. It's not a calendar-based grazing system. And it's definitely not a lazy person's grazing approach. Where does regenerative grazing fit among all the grazing systems we hear or read about? With so many different kinds of grazing systems being mentioned these days, it can be quite confusing to keep them all straight. I developed this figure to show how many of the popular grazing systems stack up to each other on 3 different dimensions: grazing duration, grazing frequency, and stock density. On the horizontal axis, we have grazing duration and grazing frequency, which are really 2 sides of the same coin. Grazing duration is measuring how long livestock spend in a given area, and grazing frequency is measuring how frequently livestock are regrazing the same plant. The longer livestock spend in one area, the more frequently they graze the same plants. On the vertical axis, we have stock density, which is measuring the concentration of livestock, or how close together they are over a given area. As stock density increases, livestock are brought closer together and each animal is afforded less space. In the prior slide, I mentioned that regenerative grazing is not a specific grazing system because, as you can see here, regenerative grazing can fit into any of the grazing systems under the right set of circumstances. It's very important to note that any of the grazing systems within the green oval can be regenerative, meaning that they have the potential to be regenerative. The key words in that phrase are can be, because it's all dependent on how they are implemented. If some of the more intensively managed grazing systems are inappropriately applied, they can actually cause more damage than continuous grazing, but with 10 times the work to get overgrazing. This is because with continuous grazing, generally only a certain percentage of the plants are getting overgrazed while other plants become too mature and the livestock ignore them. On the other hand, with the more intensively managed grazing systems, a much greater percentage of the plants are getting overgrazed. With truly regenerative grazing, 4 things need to flex over time: grazing timing, grazing duration, grazing frequency, and stock density. This helps to improve plant diversity and forage productivity over the long haul. There are times to be more aggressive with your management, but there are also times when things need to relax to a lower intensity, but still moving livestock frequently enough during the growing season to avoid overgrazing if you want to stay on a regenerative trajectory. This is important to realize because you'll obviously have other things demanding your attention at certain times of the year that will necessitate a lower intensity of management. For example, let's say you and your family want to take a little vacation together for a couple of weeks during the growing season. For grazing to be regenerative in all aspects, it also needs to improve the quality of our lives, which means our relationships with others, most importantly, our family. In such cases, it's perfectly fine to give the livestock more area to accommodate their needs for the time you're going to be away. Will some overgrazing happen? Yes, but that's not the end of the world. Just plan to give that area some extra recovery time before grazing it again. This flowchart shows how a regenerative grazing approach can affect the plants, soils, water cycle, animals, and the economics of the grazing operation. We start at the top of the chart with beneficial grazing practices that prevent overgrazing by allowing full plant recovery. This has benefits both above and below ground, which is like a ripple effect throughout the pasture ecosystem. Note that boxes are color-coded according to the part of the pasture ecosystem that's affected. Arrows inside the boxes point up or down, signifying an increase or decrease in a specific component. The big picture here is that all of our actions, whether positive or negative, do not affect just one thing. Because we're dealing with a living ecosystem that is constantly changing, our grazing management affects several things at once. If we assign the number 1 to each one of the 3 main inputs of regenerative grazing as shown by the 3 black boxes at the top, and if you add up all the benefits that result from them, shown by the multicolored boxes, then 1 plus 1 plus 1 equals 72. I don't know anything that returns like that. As we close, here are some principles of regenerative grazing that I'd like to review. Optimize plant disturbance by fluctuating grazing timing, duration, frequency, and intensity. Optimize soil cover. Optimize photosynthesis. Optimize diversity of life above and below ground. Continuously monitor and adjust grazing management. And finally, integrate livestock on cropland where possible with diverse blends of annual forage species and high stock densities. Here are some resources for you to tap into should you want to know more about regenerative agriculture. Thank you for watching this presentation. Should you have any questions, please feel free to contact me via phone or email as shown here. Happy grazing!